Wir haben hier Professor Niall Ferguson von der London School of Economics, einer der Starreferenten am Institutional Money Kongress, und die Gelegenheit, ihm einige Fragen zu stellen. Professor Ferguson, on the way that the West will lose its dominating role while the East will take it over, what are you talking about when you use the term East?
Well, of course, it's a broad concept. It includes not just China, though. We also have to recognize that emerging Asia as a whole has been growing very strongly for most of the last 30 or 40 years. India is a latecomer, but the trail was blazed by Japan, South Korea, Singapore. And so the scenario which is already, I think, well underway is a scenario in which Asia, and particularly emerging Asia, overtakes the West, by which of course I mean Europe, North America, not forgetting those areas of European settlement like Australia, which are a very long way from Europe.
What will be the consequences of this development?
Well, in some ways the consequences are very good, because it's great that the most populous countries in the world, China and India, are emerging from 500 years of economic stagnation, and as they grow, of course, they become consumers for Western exports, and that's something that, of course, the German economy has benefited from a great deal since the financial crisis. It's been exports to emerging markets that have really got the German manufacturing sector back on its feet. But there's another side to this story, which is that the world is no longer a world which the West automatically dominates. And I think we all got quite used during and after the Cold War to Western predominance. Why not? After all, Western predominance was the major theme of the last half millennium. It's just a bit of a surprise, I think, to most of us to find that it's no longer what the West decides that determines the way the world goes. What I wanted to try to argue in my talk this morning was this, that the single biggest decision in the world is no longer American monetary policy. It may, in fact, be Chinese monetary policy.
History teaches us that a country on its way from an emerging economy to an industrialized one will sooner or later undergo a severe setback or even a painful recession, depression. Is that a problem that China will have to face, and especially will China be able to deal with it?
Well, it would certainly be surprising if China were able to go from being a relatively poor economy, accounting for 2% of global GDP, to the largest economy in the world, which is what it's on track to be, without some kind of setback. In most Asian miracles, there's been at least one financial crisis, because while it's easy enough to get an industrial economy with export-led growth, it's quite hard to transition to an economy in which financial services play a significant role. And Chinese financial institutions are still very underdeveloped. So you could well imagine a problem in that area, and indeed it may happen as soon as this year, because one way that China avoided a major crisis in 2008-2009 was through massive credit expansion. That has now generated some inflationary pressures that are clearly worrying the Chinese leadership a lot. So it's reasonable to expect, and indeed I would predict, a financial tightening, a monetary tightening in China in the course of this year. What they will be nervous of is doing that so hard that they actually create a serious recession, particularly in their export sector. So it's a very delicate balancing act that the Chinese have to strike right now. And of course there are bound to be bumps in the road, but let's not forget two things. One, they've already come through the biggest stress test imaginable, the financial crisis, where their exports to the West collapsed. And two, this is a regime which has a great deal more legitimacy than people in the West realize. It's probably one of the most popular regimes in the world in terms of its popularity with its own people. And the ordinary Chinese, I think, are far more tolerant of this regime than most people assume. They realize that they are getting more economic success from this regime than the Chinese have enjoyed in 500 years, and certainly more than their parents or grandparents enjoyed. And I think they'll cut Beijing some slack if there has to be a slowdown in the middle of this year.
What about the time frame of this development, or what will be the milestones of the development in your expectation?
Well, let's talk first about milestones that have already been passed. I mean, China is already ahead of Germany as an originator of patents, of new technology, and that in itself is remarkable. It's already ahead of Germany as an industrial producer. Its manufacturing sector is now bigger than Germany's. The big question is, when does China overtake the United States in terms of gross domestic product? That's what everybody is watching for. It overtook Japan last year in 2010, and I think it will overtake the United States unless something goes very badly wrong at some point in the next 10 years. So that's probably going to be one of the turning points that gets the headlines, because of course the United States has been the biggest economy in the world since 1872. In other words, this will end more than a century, indeed a century, close to a century and a half of American economic primacy. Will it happen? It's not guaranteed, but it seems to me very likely.
Does that mean there is no hope for the West?
Well, I think there is hope in the sense that we'd be in a far worse position if these Asian economies weren't growing so fast. If the world had been essentially the West dominating the rest, then we would have had something much more like the Great Depression of the early 1930s. But because the rest, to some degree, decoupled from the West during the financial crisis, we're all better off than we would have been. So hope, yeah, for sure there's hope. But we've got to focus on sorting out our own problems. It's not enough, for example, for Americans to blame the Chinese currency policy for their troubles. America has troubles of its own which have to be addressed, particularly its fiscal crisis, which in my view is huge and the biggest threat to American economic stability. Europe, of course, has a crisis of its own within the Eurozone, and that can only be addressed, it seems to me, with institutional and structural reforms that will be extremely hard to achieve politically. So, yeah, there's hope, but we've got to start working a lot harder and being, I think, a lot more realistic about our future than we've been in the last 10 years.
Thank you very much, Professor Ferguson.